This episode of the Defunctland Podcast has been significantly edited down for time. If you are interested in listening to a bonus episode of this interview containing more great stories and information, head over to patreon.com/defunctland to learn more.
When you wished upon a star.
Now we want you to share with us our latest and greatest dream. Disneyland.
Just go to Action Park. There's no other park like it.
Six Flags Great Adventure. It's not a world away.
Paramount's Kings Island.
We will officially open Universal Studios Florida.
Hello, I'm Michael Eisner.
Now, here is your host.
Hi, and welcome back to the Defunctland Podcast. My name is Kevin Perger. On today's show, I am joined by one of the most prominent figures in my most recent 2 episodes on Euro Disneyland, Imagineer Tim Delaney. Tim, how are you doing today?
Doing great, Kevin. I look forward to having this discussion.
I am too. This is unbelievable that I have you on. I mean, honestly, I've interviewed people that have worked on the rides that I've talked about. I've had people that have operated the rides, but this is the first time that I've been able to interview the head designer on an attraction that I've done an episode on. So I'm extremely grateful that you're here today, and I'm sure the audience is too, if you could only hear the applause.
Well, okay, it'll be the first time I've gotten applause today, but that's
one round
okay.
a day.
I'm looking forward to it.
One round of applause every day.
Yeah, at least one a day. Yeah.
Well, to get started, I'm really curious about everything you did in the 34 years you were at Imagineering. So if you could just tell me all of it, that'd be great.
Everything I did. Yeah. Well, I can. Let me see how quickly I can summarize it. Yeah. So let me just say that I really did enjoy, my 34 years at Imagineering. It was really quite an extraordinary place to be and an extraordinary time. I started in June of 1976. And at that time, I was working for a company called WED Enterprises. This was before it became Imagineering. And, at that time, there was basically the Walt Disney Company had 2 parks. They had Disneyland and the Magic Kingdom at Walt Disney World. And so, when I would tell people I work for WED Enterprises, they go like, what is that? And I go, what is Disney? And they go, Disney? What? Oh, Disney. That's that little cartoon studio over in the valley, right? And I'm like, yeah. And when you compare that at that time, the attitude compared to what the Walt Disney Company media entertainment juggernaut that it is today, it's really quite an amazing transition from one company to what it was then to what has become today. And a lot of it has to do with and what I feel extremely fortunate about the era that I worked in is that I worked with all the original theme park Disneyland designers who Walt had handpicked. I mean, there was Herbie Ryman and Exitencio and Albertino and Claude Coates and Ken O'Brien and all those guys, extraordinary talented people. And at the time, I was a young guy and I didn't know them for anything. But I have to say that it was really quite an extraordinary time for me because although I wasn't raised as a huge, through my adolescence, I wasn't a huge, Disney fan. Being raised here in Southern California, I did go to Disneyland quite often. And I will say that one of the things that launched me into which I now reflect back on, one of the things that launched me on my career is that Walt Disney had a series of television shows about space travel. And when I was very young, like 5 or 6 years old, the Man in Space program came out, which were 3 shows that were produced by Ward Kimball. And it was Man in Space, Man in the Moon. And I think there's another name for that one also, but and then Mars and Beyond. And I have to say that even at a very young age, I was really kind of hooked on, futuristic things. I wasn't a big fan I was like, okay, Tomorrowland, Fantasyland, Adventureland, okay. But when it became, Tomorrowland, when I watched the television show when Walt would come out, I was immediately hooked on that. And for some reason, I didn't realize it then, but it really kind of set me on this pace of doing what I ended up doing. And the reason it did that is because when I watched these television shows, I was completely fascinated by the concept that Walt Disney could get his artists together, take a subject, and create that subject on his television show that was so realistic that that I thought it was real. As a matter of fact, I said something to my mother like, have we gone into outer space? I think I was 6 years old or something like that. And she goes, no. I think Mr. Disney just made that up. And I was like, he just made it up, but it seems so real. And at that time, when I started realizing that when you could visualize something, and once people see that visual, then they suddenly believe that it can be real and it can be true. And that was really the basic foundation of my entire career. I, at a very young age, started drawing, and my parents let me just draw on the walls. I did these huge chalk drawings of cars and things on my walls in my room. And, but I didn't have any formal training until I got to college. And, but the whole thing of like doing futuristic things, I watched every futuristic movie, I saw everything that, that would come out. And what I loved about the Walt stuff is that it was very entertaining, it was very educational, and it didn't all have monsters in it. It was actually kind of very positive. So I, to make a long story short, I ended up going through my high school and then end up, after a couple of years of college, going to Art Center College of Design here in Los Angeles. And that was a big, huge turning point for me, because that's where I really learned how to draw and paint and create things that had never been seen before. I was an industrial designer. So that kind of launched me in my career. And what happened at that time is, and it was really an unusual thing too, is that I got out of school and I started working for several design companies. And one of my instructors, who I'd had 3 years beforehand, I'd been out of school for 3 years, he called me and he said that he was looking for someone who had my skills of drawing and designing and all that, and he worked for WED Enterprises. And I was like, okay, I didn't even know what WED Enterprises was. And he explained, well, they're the division that does all the work on the theme parks. Mostly they've been doing a lot of work for Disneyland. And, obviously the Magic Kingdom of Florida. So I was like, I don't know. And so I wasn't really that interested in working there. I was in another business at the time. And then 6 months later, I was interested and they weren't. And then 6 months after that, we mutually got together and I started working in 1976. And just as I had actually walked into Art Center and found, oh my God, this was, the school for me, I walked into this place and I was completely amazed, because here was this enormous facility in Glendale, California. There isn't one name that says Walt Disney Imagineering or WED Enterprise, or nothing even says Disney on it. Not one sign says Disney on it. And it's actually a very difficult place to get into. I mean, it's almost impossible to get into, but the buildings are just these random ugly industrial buildings. And I couldn't even find it on my first interview. So I finally got there and I interviewed and I showed my stuff. And lo and behold, they hired me, and it was pretty amazing. I will tell you that what I was hired to do is I was hired in the graphics department, and the graphics department was very involved in doing a lot of signage, and they also did a lot of work when corporate sponsors, as many people here know, corporate sponsors come to Disney attractions. They have to put, whatever the name of the attraction is presented by, Kodak or Bank of America or whatever it is. So the graphics department used to do a lot of that. Plus, they used to do a lot of the posters. So I did all the illustrations for them and a lot of design work. For them, I designed we were building Space Mountain at Disneyland at the time, and I did the Starcade. And so I just started doing that. And the one thing that I will say that I had this insatiable curiosity, to be honest with you, when I had this opportunity to be inside WED Enterprises, they used to have, like every day at 10 o'clock, obviously at noon, and at 3 o'clock, they would have breaks, 10 o'clock and 3 o'clock. They'd have these breaks. I spent every second that I was not in my office walking around, looking at every division that was there. Mapo, the construction company, was on the 1401 Flower lot. And I went and I introduced myself and I met people, and I met Herbie Ryman, and I met, all the great guys, John Hench and Marty Sklar was running the company at the time. And, and it was quite extraordinary. And I ended up meeting and finding all the people that I had looked up to when I was, I remember working with Ward Kimball, and I told him it was just, Ward Kimball was just a crazy guy to work with. But he was the one that was a producer for the Man in Space programs for Walt. And so it was, it was really quite rewarding. It was really quite fun to do that. So, I started working. Like as I said, for the first year, I started working, and I realized that when I went around and I visited all of these guys, and a lot of them, a good example would be, Sam McKim. Sam McKim was a great artist, and he was a great cowboy artist. He'd been a cowboy child star. And a lot of these guys who were originally the older guys working on Disneyland were really, really great artists, but they weren't contemporary guys. And I had my portfolio filled with space paintings and robots and all this other stuff. And so I decided that although I was working there at Imagineering, I went home every night and I started working on a new portfolio, and I started doing, different kinds of illustrations, because the rumor had been out that the company was actually going to go into a new project called Epcot Center. And I thought, oh, this is great. I would love to do this. It has Future World and it has World Showcase, and, it'll be great. I'll stick in the Future World side. So I went in and I did that, and I spent a year doing that. And then I went to my boss, the guy who had hired me, the instructor I'd had at Art Center. And I just said, hey, I really think I could do more for the company. And I'd like to show my portfolio to John Hench and Marty Sklar and all the other management people here. So they were like, and he was like, yeah, I guess if you want to, you can. So I said, all right, I set meetings up. So I set these meetings up with these, the people who were running Imagineering. And I started showing my portfolio. And right in the middle of the first time I did it, Marty said to me, and John, they're both looking at me like, don't you already work here? I said, yeah, I do already work here, but I think I could do more. I think I could do more things for you, So lo and behold, about 2 weeks later, I was laid off.
What was it? Was it because of the meeting?
No. I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that. I would just say they came. My boss said, "Oh, look, we ran out of work. We just don't have any time for you, or we don't have anything for you." And so I said, "Okay." So I had been doing a series of Space Mountain paintings, poster paintings. I took those off the wall, and I went and talked to the man who was running Epcot Center, and I said, I think I could really help you. But I've just been let go. So they gave me 2 weeks severance pay, and I went home. And a week later, I get a call and said, come on back. They moved me upstairs into the concept design area. And my office was about, I would say, maybe 10 or 12 feet away from Herb Ryman's. And so I had that office for about 6 years. And I just worked on concepts. And I just started drawing for Epcot Center. They would just say, this is kind of what we want to do. What would you do? And so I started drawing, and I did all these rough sketches, and I have, I have millions of paintings and drawings that I had done there, and it was really quite exciting to do that. And so, and Herb Ryman, Herbie was, was such a saint. Herbie has the most important drawing in the Walt Disney Company, and that's that original drawing of Disneyland. But Herbie was just a great guy, an amazing guy, and I got to know these talented people, and I feel very, very fortunate that happened. Because these are the guys who were like working for Walt directly, and I had a chance to work with them. And over the years, they all began fading away, but I worked on overall concepts for Epcot Center, and then I shifted gears and went into developing the Living Seas Pavilion. And so and I ended up doing and producing and designing the Living Seas Pavilion, and opened that up in 1985. And so that was, it was really a great time. It was a very exciting time at Imagineering, because Epcot was no matter what we all think of it today, good, bad, or indifferent, or how it's changing, whatever. But when you go back and you think about the difference between the Magic Kingdom and what Epcot Center is all about, it was quite extraordinary. It was, ride systems that had never been invented before. I mean, the Energy Pavilion was just amazing, and trying to get that ride to go inside the ball for Spaceship Earth. And, we created the world's largest saltwater tank for the Living Seas Pavilion. And, it was just an amazing thing. And, I know that there were challenges with it, and there were probably cost overruns and all that, but it was a really good but amazing rookie team that was working on it. I mean, I was one of the younger ones working on the project, but we didn't have a big creative staff at all, and but we had to do something, and I think that the spirit of Walt was watching over us. And
but before we get into Epcot and all of that, I want to ask a question real quick about your early days at Imagineering. You said you walked around during your breaks and you looked at all the different technology and all the different concepts. What was something that stood out to you that might be recognizable to theme park fans or Disney fans? What did you see that might have later been implemented, but you saw it, before it was produced?
Okay, I'll tell you. I have to tell you, that's a really good question, because I have a really good answer about that. I was over at MAPA one day, and I was going through, oh my gosh, what's the name of it? I was going through, did they call it Pelican Alley? I don't know. They had this whole long line. It was almost like a production line of animatronic figures, where they would be assembling when Disney was doing a lot of animatronic figures. And I'd go through there and I just talk to the guys, because I love mechanical things on top of being able to draw. I used to work on, my brother and I used to build cars and hot rods and all that stuff. So I love mechanical things. And I had gone by this one guy's desk a couple of times. Hey, what are you working on? He kind of looked at me like, you look like you're interested. He says, hey, you want to see something here? So I go, yeah. So I go over to his workbench. They had these big giant workbenches, with all kinds of, lathes all over the place and soldering guns and nuts and bolts and all this stuff. And there was a head there that was covered in fabric, So he kind of does a look, kind of a furtive look left and right, And he says, oh, here, I want to show you this. So he takes the head off, and it's a pirate head. And he picks up a microphone, and he starts talking into it. When he starts talking into it, the mouth starts moving. I said, this is fantastic. I mean, you really can do this? He goes, yeah. And this is typical of what you would find in those days. Is that somebody who had a real interest, was really smart, just decided, wouldn't it be cool if we could just talk into a microphone and the animatronic figure would talk? Okay, now I'm talking, this is like 1978. Okay, this is a long time ago. And so I said, this is fantastic. What are you going to do? And he goes, he eventually left the company and started his own big animation company. And he obviously, whatever he had developed belonged to the Disney company, and they probably, and I'm certain that they've used it. But I would go back into my office and I'd go, hey, have you seen what Bob, I'll call him Bob, see what he's working on over there? And most of the people who had been there for a long time, it was kind of a lazy, I used to call it the lazy W, I'm talking, these guys have been around, a lot of these guys have been around for a long time. And there was a new energy that was coming into the company, but I was like, hey, did you see what's his name is working on that, animatronic figure? I'm like, no, don't know what he's doing. I have no idea what he's doing, And, but again, if I could give, and I'll probably give it a couple more times credit, but if I could say of all the things that I was fortunate enough to do is to work with really extraordinary people. I mean, if you kind of step back and you consider that Walt Disney Imagineering encompasses like 150 different disciplines, and you're talking about lighting people, engineering people, recording artists, model builders, sculptors, these are the best people in the world. And it was really so amazing to work with. And so when somebody has their own motivation to do something, it's kind of cool to see them do it. And, I don't know why he was being, he had his own reason for being kind of secretive about it. But I was, for some reason, he felt compelled to show me the secret. So, I think there are lots of things that you find out. There were a lot of people who, one of the insights that I would give to other people about Imagineering is that you generally find that whatever somebody does, it's usually their hobby which got them there. You might find guys working in the special effects department, and you find out that they're magicians some other place, or people who are in the costuming department and work on theatrical shows in the outside world. So everyone kind of brings their personal interests and their personal disciplines to what their work was about, and that's why it was really focused and crafted about people's skills and people's love for what they were doing. It wasn't necessarily they all went to school all the time, but to learn something, but they just had some innate desire to want to learn how to do something. I think about those kind of guys, and they were just amazing people to work with.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, that definitely answered my question. Now we can go on to Epcot. Okay, so did you just work on the Living Seas Pavilion for Epcot, or did you work on other things?
Well, I worked on almost all of the attractions. See, I did a lot of the overall design. I did, a lot of point of view drawings when they were just trying to figure out what Epcot was. Not what I'm saying is regarding the placemaking of it, not the content so much. I mean, I designed things for all. I didn't do anything on Imagination. That was mostly Tony Baxter and his team. But I think I worked on something for the Energy Pavilion. I mean, interior drawings, and there was a whole ending to the World of Motion ride, which you went through this. There was this whole kind of futuristic city made out of metal, and we had fog effects and all that. And I had designed all of that. And God, what else? There was, I'm sure, and whenever they would actually need something to like Epcot was mostly, a lot of the story themes were cavemen to space shuttles. So when it came, they had a lot of good caveman people who could do all that and the historical stuff. But when it came to the more futuristic stuff, I ended up doing a lot of spacecraft and I did a lot of the renderings and designs for those kinds of things. It's just, I guess because I was interested in, I was younger and, I was kind of like, hey, let's go. I mean, I was a huge space fan. I was a huge, let's go. I mean, from the Apollo, the whole man in space, or the whole, from Mercury, Gemini, all that. I was a big fan of that. And I still follow it quite closely today. But, but the one that I actually took from the day we put, the first sketch all the way through. And there was a previous iteration of the Living Seas Pavilion that had a big giant ride around the tank, but a lot of that they just couldn't afford to do anymore. So I came in at that point, and from those first sketches to all the way to the day that we cut the ribbon, that's what I did on most of my projects were taken from the very initial concept sketches all the way through to the opening day. That was just what I did. So
okay, so you're there during the development of the Living Seas. So what was the Living Seas going to be if it wasn't what it became?
It was, and again, this was I think Tony Baxter had worked on it, and John Olson, and they had some other guys working on it. But the tank itself was 200 feet in diameter. And then the ride went kind of on the outside of it, but you never saw the tank. The last view was going to be as you're going in there. And it was very, very kind of fantastic, kind of oversized, kelp and oversized elements of undersea. And it was very lyrical, and it was a musical kind of, tribute, I guess, to the rhythms of the oceans and things like that. So, it was very fanciful. But what happened is that for some reason I got caught in working on these projects, and you're going to hear about it for Disneyland Paris or Euro Disneyland, depending on how you want to call it, where the projects would start out and then they ended up, having problems. And so the Living Seas Pavilion, they realized that they had to, we can't spend that kind of money anymore. The pavilions were, costing more than the $35 million sponsorship fees. And so they had to start all over again. So they just said, we can't afford this ride going on the outside. So, for the Living Seas Pavilion, the things didn't really kick into gear until we got a sponsor, and United Technologies was the sponsor. And they were interested more in the Space Pavilion, but we had developed the Living Seas Pavilion. So they just wanted to be in as soon as possible. So they didn't ask them for the $35 million. They asked them for probably twice that. I think it was something like twice that. And they paid for it. And so we actually got a bill. There's another story. Do you want to hear another story about George Lucas? I can tell you a story about George Lucas.
I am always up for a George Lucas story. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So I was always trying to pitch to do a space pavilion. So Star Wars had come out in May of 1977. And I'm not sure that I've ever told this story on a podcast, so this is a real coup for you. So about a year after it opened, it was probably the summer of ’78. Marty called me and said, "Listen, can you come to tomorrow afternoon? We're having a meeting with George Lucas. We want to talk to him about doing something with the Space Pavilion." So I said, "Right, great." So it was John Hench, Marty, me, a guy by the name of Gene Johnson, and George were just in Hench's office. And Marty, said, "Hey, we were thinking about doing a space pavilion, George. Would you want to, help us on this?" And this was, George Lucas was kind of like little George Lucas. This is before he became big George Lucas. I mean, it was after Star Wars, but these guys all became super celebrities as those movies moved on. So I remember in one conversation, George says, "Well, if we're going to do a space pavilion, at the end of the pavilion, we have to meet an alien." And I knew this was never going to fly because Epcot was not meant to be a theme park. Right? So anyway, we end the meeting and we go our magic ways. Okay. This was a Thursday afternoon. So I was going to San Francisco on Friday. So I go to the Burbank airport, and I'm waiting to go to San Francisco. I had a girlfriend that had lived up there at the time. And I see George leaning against the wall. So he looks at me, he kind of nods like, "Hey, So I said, I walked over to him, and we were about to go on the airplane, and I said, "Hey, mind if I sit with you? I want to talk with you." And he goes, "Sure, yeah, come on, sit down." So at that time, there were all these discussions that were going on about like how bad Ron Miller was because he turned down Star Wars. And, when you sit at the patio at Imagineering, people talk about all this stuff and goodness and badness and all this stuff. So I sat there and I made a mental note to myself. I said, this is my opportunity. I'm going to ask him, because people are like, "Oh, Disney was terrible. They turned down Star Wars and all that." So I said, "George, I want to ask you a question. Did you bring Star Wars to the Walt Disney Studios?" And, because I'm thinking, I'm going to get it from the horse's mouth. I'm going to get the right answer. And he goes, "Yeah, I did." He says, "I did. I'll tell you, I had brought it because I was always admired the Walt Disney Studios when I was growing up. And it was just like, like all of us, we loved all the kind of magical, creative stuff that Walt Disney did. And he was always an inspiration. He was an inspiration to George Lucas and Steven Spielberg and all those guys." He says, "Yeah, I did bring it to the studio, but I already had made my deal at 20th Century Fox." So I'm thinking, oh, no kidding. So when I sit in the patio next time, people go, "Ron Miller's an idiot because he turned down Star Wars." I go, "Not so fast. Not so fast." So I got it from the horse's mouth. So if you want to argue about it, let's just, there it is. So I felt like, there you go. That was one. And I'm not sure that I've ever told anybody outside of Imagineering that story.
Well, I'm glad I could be the first. That's fantastic. Okay, so we talked about Epcot, and that's in the mid-'80s. So we're now nearing production on Euro Disney and Euro Disneyland. What did you do leading up to Euro Disneyland? And then kind of just take me into that project.
Well, let's see. So I started that. So I finished that in '85, and then we started. That was the beginning of '85. And so, so what did I work on? I was starting to work because we didn't start. We actually started developing a Disneyland or Euro Disneyland in 1986, and we spent a year working on it. And then it went on hiatus for a while because they were in the process of negotiating things. And so we didn't really get going to develop sincerely. I mean, it was really a funded project. I would say in like maybe the middle of '87 or '88, something, or like beginning of '88, something like that. It must have been '87 because it takes 5 years to do those projects. So immediately after Living Seas Pavilion, I don't know, there was always something that I was working on. I have to go back, and I don't really know what it was, but we really started working on. And once the opportunity came up, I raised my hand. I thought, I want to go to Paris. I want to work on Paris. It was great. It was a great team. The energy in the company was phenomenal. They could do no wrong. I mean, the management, whatever they touched turned to gold. And as I said, it was worth it because they changed everything they brought in professionals, and I mean, briefly going back to Living Seas Pavilion, I mean, Michael changed everything in terms of, you earlier you asked me about IPs and things like that. Well, we all started complaining. We all started talking about that. We don't have anything here. So that's where they changed everything. Michael Eisner wanted, like, how do we update the company? So that's where we brought in Michael Jackson. They brought in, I'll give credit to Tony Baxter. I mean, Tony would say, like, why can't we be Lucas? Why don't we get Indiana Jones? Why don't we do Star Wars here? Why don't we do this? And so, those guys were not, Eisner and Wells and those guys were not stuck in the old way of doing Disney thing, because the old management was like, Disney, if it isn't Disney, it has to be, that's it. So they were like, Michael would be like, sure, bring in Michael Jackson, sure, let's go talk to George Lucas. We did, Michael greenlit Raiders of the Lost Ark, so he knew all those guys. So that's when things changed, and that's when that IP thing really changed. And now they don't, they won't build a hot dog cart without without theming to it, a name to it. So, they're redoing all my, and it's okay by me. They're redoing everything at Paradise Pier that I did for Pixar Pier. And, I'm okay with that. Actually, I always thought DCA should have been a whole Pixar thing anyway, but.
Absolutely. I've said that many times. The whole park should just be Pixar. Unfortunately, I don't think that's going to happen. No, but you're getting me distracted. You mentioned California Adventure, and I'm going to get off on a tangent, but let's just go back to, let's eventually get into Space Mountain. So did you have a fascination with this ride, Space Mountain in general, the originals?
I do, but sometimes when you love something a lot, you also realize, how can we make it better? So one of the reasons why the reason I probably did like Space Mountain so much was because when I first started in '76, I worked on the Space Mountain here at Disneyland, and I did part of the Space Mountain complex. Was they
obviously you have to have some sort of,
and they built Space Mountain with a big stage in front, and then if you look in plan view, the stage and the seating area was flanked by two major wings. One of them was a restaurant, and the other one was an arcade. And I did the Starcade.
Okay, I'm gonna stop you. I'm gonna stop you right there, because I just want to note this. This is the one of two that I know of, and I'm compiling a list of arcades that I believe exist solely for puns in Disney.
Really?
The Starcade and the Arcade, which is on the cruise ships. But I know I'm sure I know the Starcade, which is no longer there, right?
I don't think it's even open. I haven't seen it, but there is like a 100-foot long painting that a mural that I did that I think is still there. I didn't paint it, but I did the concept work where I did the painting of it, and then there were some scenic people who painted. But I think some of the stuff may still be there. I don't know. I tried getting rid of it several times, to be honest with you.
The Starcade, I tried getting rid of.
The reason is because I wanted to do something. I wanted to make a change for the Space Mountain at Disneyland. I wanted to make a complete ride change for that.
Can you talk to me about this? Because now that you mentioned it, it's a rumor, like I was talking about earlier. So tell me about what your plan was for this change.
Okay, well, this is one of those ones that didn't happen, right? Maybe I should have included it because I keep forgetting about this. What happened is that Space Mountain opened in 1977 or 78, I guess it was. So let me just finish that story. First of all, one of the reasons why I loved it is that there was an industrial designer who I worked with, he was older than I was, a guy who was the art director on it. His name is George McGinnis. And George did all the design work for the Space Mountain down there. And walking into the load-unload area with the spacecraft hanging up above you, and it was like walking into a real movie set. And I still, when I think about it, I have such fond memories of that, And I was doing another part of it, and it was about, I would say maybe it was about a year, maybe about 8 or 9 months before Space Mountain at Disneyland opened. So I could go in there and I could, walk around and, look at the rides and look at all the design that George had done. And it was fantastic. So that's one of the reasons why I brought it up. But there were certain elements to that ride that I just had never loved. And I fixed it. I fixed it when I did the Space Mountain in Paris. One thing I didn't love, and I must have been the Lone Ranger on this because, but what I never loved is I didn't love the 3 lifts getting you to the top. Okay. I just you go up, lift, lift, lift. And I went, no, if we're going to go to space, I want to be shot to the moon. That's what I want. Because I wanted to do a catapult launch on everything that I have done, because it was, the Space Mountain in Paris, in terms of a catapult launch connected to a full-length roller coaster. That was the first one. Now that ride system was a ride system that was developed by Vekoma or somebody as it was a not very far, and they had this ride called Montezuma's Revenge, which is it was a cable-driven system. It launched a train into a loop and up, and then ran out. In terms of the track just went higher and higher and higher, went through that, and then it went backwards through the loop again, back into the station. That's what it did. I remember riding it, and I'm like, hold on a second. If you're taking a passenger, you're taking a train that's got, I don't know, how many would it be, like 24 passengers on board, and you launch it, and it goes into a loop, and then the track runs out, and then you just kind of run the energy on. Certainly, you have enough energy to launch you to the top of Space Mountain and drop you down, and so that's what that was a campaign that I pitched, for doing Space Mountain in Paris. But going back, when there was going to be a big renovation of Disneyland Space Mountain, the track had just fallen apart. I mean, it was just a disaster, right? And they were going to just gut the building and start all over again, and for Disneyland. So I said, well, wait a minute. Well, why don't we do something else? And so this comes back to what I was saying about the Starcade. What I wanted to do was have everybody load in the Starcade, and then the Starcade would go out, or excuse me, the train would go out of the Starcade on a raised platform, kind of like where rocket rods used to be, and around the rocket jets, and then went back in front of Space Mountain over by where the old Mission to Mars was, it's where the pizza planet is right now. And then I was going to shoot it into the mountain. So then you would have the entire mountain for track. And that's what we do in Paris. It's the same size building. So we didn't have the load and load. Load and load was outside, And so I did a track layout, and, and I said, but I had opposition at WDI. I mean, there are people who are traditionalists, and no, we got to keep the same thing, keep the same thing. But then I had somebody take my drawings over to the studio, and they were talking to Eisner. And then once they spent all the money to get it done, Eisner was the first one to say, well, if you spent all that money, why didn't you just make a different ride? So, but they didn't. It's fine. And people love the ride. I mean, I still kind of I still love the ride. It's nostalgic for me. So I'm okay with it. It's fine. It's fine. And they've done, the Star Wars, whatever the big Star Wars overlay for it is, it's great. So I mean, it's a much, the track is a lot better and all that. But it was that motivation for doing Disneyland Paris's Space Mountain over there. So that was, that's, whenever you want to start on that, we can start on that.
So from the beginning, when you heard about the Paris project, you were the one that said, I want to go to Paris, right?
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, Tony was like talking to, Tony Baxter was kind of the creative executive involved in charge of it. And he wanted to pick the people he wanted who had real theme park experience. Because to me, I think Disneyland Paris, in terms of the actual design and opening day attractions and the number of attractions and all that, I think it's the best park we've ever done. It's really a kind of a sad thing that it hasn't performed. It hasn't performed like it should. But in terms of the design, it's really great. I mean, Tom Morris did Main Street, or Fantasyland. Eddie Sato did Main Street. Brilliant job. I mean, Eddie turned Main Street into an attraction. It's so beautifully done. Tom, I think the castle in Paris is the best one ever. And Chris Tietz did a great job on Adventureland, really kind of much more integrated kind of land than they've ever done before. And Jeff Burke was Frontierland, and it was a great group to work with. The Walt Disney Company was just, everything it touched, it turned to gold. Michael was deeply involved. Frank was deeply involved, and it was a great, great project. I mean, it was great to live over there. It was great to, spent 5 years in Paris, and it's like I wasn't working. I wasn't there full time. I was then, my wife and my kids were really tiny. My daughter was like 3 years old, and then my son. We were there for a long time. But I was there, maybe 6 to 7 months a year for 5 years, and then the last was almost full time. I guess I was going back and forth because I had all these other projects to work on. So I wasn't there full time, and there were issues about people. Full time people are really expensive to patriate over there. So anyway, but more importantly, I think just doing Discoveryland, the whole concept of Discoveryland was like, the most, fun thing to do because, we've done so many Tomorrowlands and we all get tired of, they all become yesterday lands as soon as you open them. But collectively we decided that if we're going to go to Paris, and we do this all the time, we kind of focus the project themes, most of the park, because Walt had pulled all of his stories from Western Europe. It was kind of easy to do. Fantasyland is all built in, those are all the stories. The Europeans are fascinated by the Old West, so Frontierland was a slam dunk. Main Street, I think, was, as I said, Eddie Sato turned into a terrific attraction in terms of things to do, and it was more than just like a passageway and retail and food. There were more activities going on there, and then Adventureland really had its own unique feel to it, and I think it's because Pirates anchored it, and they made more of the treehouse was much more of an attraction and all that. But for Discoveryland, it was taken away from when we got rid of the Tomorrowland name and wanted to do something about, really dedicated to the great European visionaries of Europe, Jules Verne and H.G. Wells. And so out of that, what I did is I developed a system, and I actually did this really interesting analysis of the parks because when you think about the parks, if you look at Frontierland, or if you look at Fantasyland, or if you look at Adventureland, those are a collection of those stories, whether it's the stories or different cultures, whether it's part German or part Italian, or for Fantasyland, or if you go to the Old West, there's the conventional old Western town, and then there's the desert section, and what all the lands were. Traditionally, all the lands were a collection of what that subject happened to be. Adventureland was a collection of exotic ports, right? But Tomorrowland's had a tendency to end up being one thing. It was one vision of the future. So I'm like, let's not do this. Let's do essentially, a history of the future. So there was a Jules Verne future, and there was an H.G. Wells vision of the future. There was a George Lucas vision of the future, and then our Autopia ended up being. What I decided to do on all of them is to say, like, if we're going to do a driving experience, what's the heyday of driving experiences? Well, it's those 1930s, magazine covers of Popular Mechanics and Popular Science, where, and Walt's old, 1950s thing of Magic Highways, which was dreams of driving uninterrupted from Los Angeles to New York on a super highway. So everything about that theme was that vision of the future. So we weren't really trying to do something where it's one future in the future, because the future, it's the old cliched line, the future isn't what it used to be. It really is, it's something where you really, really wanted to do this collection of things. So it had a tendency to work. We found the right attraction. So for the contract for Disneyland Paris stated that the French wanted to have a show, a dedicated show, and they designated it was going to be in Tomorrowland, but Discoveryland. So it was, and they suggested this attraction would be a Circle Vision show. Well, if you know anything about the history of Circle Vision shows, they actually have a limited life cycle to them. Circle Visions are good for about 5 years,
and they're all mainly travel logs.
Yeah, they're all kind of the same thing, and it's old technology, and yeah, right, and that's what they were. So I'm like, and they go, no, okay, this is we got to have, we only have funding to do this. You have to do, really, it's really, really tough on, how do you do something unique? So again, there's a lot of brainstorming that goes on, and we said, well, why don't we turn this Circle Vision thing into an attraction? So we took and made it into a kind of a big time machine, the H.G. Wells time machine. And so, like, well, how do you make it an attraction? Like, well, let's not make it just a movie. Let's put characters in it. So we put Dreamfinder in there, and he had this whole time machine in the middle of the theater, or, to the one side of the theater.
You mean Timekeeper, right?
Timekeeper, yeah. What did I say? Did I say that?
You said Dreamfinder.
Oh my God, Dreamfinder. Did I say Dreamfinder? I really did.
Yes.
Oh my God, how did I ever get that?
That's funny.
Oh my God. Thank you for correcting me. That Timekeeper, of course, Dreamfinder. Oh my God. See, my brain is actually going, south on me. So Timekeeper, so I actually designed the robot and said, we're, not going to put a skin on it. We're going to just put, because I love the acrylic thing, and the skin, or the structure, the body of those things, and so we'll put lights in it. So our first meeting, we decided, because Robin Williams was so hot after Aladdin, so we called in Robin, and I'll never forget this. We had this meeting. It was Tom Fitzgerald and Carol Trudeau and myself, and so we had this meeting with Robin Williams, and it was on Mother's Day on a Sunday. And so he came in and we just did a read through on the whole thing. We were just sitting around like a table, and somebody I think might have been recording or something like that. So he was so funny. I mean, he was just amazingly funny and quick and fast. And I mean, he was really on his game and all that. So they had a script there. And I mean, we were all like laughing our heads off, just him doing shtick with it. And then, and so then he tried to do it in French. And then all of our French people said, once they heard the recording, they said, oh, well, his French isn't very good. So he was out. So we got another actor to do it for Paris, but then he ended up doing it for, Walt Disney World and all that. But it was the best show was in Paris. And that was really quite special. We had, the pre-show, there was a lot of money in the pre-show and trying to tell that whole story. One of the problems we had in Paris, as a matter of fact, people would see the pre-show. As soon as the pre-show was over, as the doors were opening up, they would walk out of the attraction. They thought that was the show, and it wasn't really very interesting. So we had to...
Just the pre-show video? They thought that was like the whole thing?
It was the pre-show. It had this whole room, this whole kind of laboratory with these special effects in the ceiling, and we had... it was really elaborate, and it was timekeeper on video, and he was telling about what we're going to do. We're going to go on this journey, and so and then the doors would open, and there's a figure, and he's manipulating this whole time machine.
Yeah, one of my all-time favorite defunct attractions. Really want to do an episode on it sometime. But also in Discoveryland, you have all these other attractions. I mean, you have to put in Star Tours and Captain EO because those are the given, you got to get Star Tours. It's an e-ticket. You have to get Captain EO. It's a huge hit with Michael Jackson. How do you fit that into your, very Jules Verne Victorian land?
Well, first of all, the thing, you have to remember is that we were planning on having Space Mountain there in the middle of the land, from the beginning. And it was the 100-meter diameter version of it. And then as the park... as Disneyland or as Euro Disneyland was progressing, they start looking at the books and they say, finally, we can't add that attraction. Okay, we just can't. There's just way too much money. It needs way too much development. Later on, as we were progressing, I would say we were about a year out before opening, and I think or maybe a year and a half or so out before opening. And I think Michael Eisner and Frank Wells were getting very nervous that we didn't have enough capacity. They thought it was going to be enormously, popular. And I mean, it was popular. I mean, the park has always been popular. But what happens is that they got very nervous about it. So they decided to put a couple of $100 million more into the park. And so, Tom Morris got some of it, and I got the lion's share of it. And what I got was to put in the Nautilus. We did not have a Discoveryland train station, so we got that. And then they were still looking for more attractions. So I just said, I remember I got called into a meeting at Marty's office with Tony and they said, we need to find more capacity. And I'm like, well, I can tell you an instant way you can find more capacity. On Star Tours, we have 4 bays, and we left a lot of room behind it. So if you want to pick up instant capacity, just build 2 more bays and buy 2 more simulators, and you have 6 bays. And it was a smart thing that we did at that time because, it was an easy way to add capacity. And, they were already in production on it. So it was easy to do that. To do Captain EO, we just knew that people there were extremely interested in Captain EO. It was a huge interest in France with Michael Jackson. So, I mean, you kind of, once you build a theater like that, you can always change the software out. You can change the movie out, but you have to go somewhere with it. And you want to make sure you have enough attractions and that are popular enough. But a lot of it has to do with the budgets, and you're always under scrutiny about how budgets and how close you are sticking to budgets. And those are the days where you had to stay on budget. You absolutely had to stay on budget. So, we got enough out there. I mean, Autopia came in a little bit late, that was after opening. And then the other challenge that I had was there are corporate sponsorships that go on with all of these parks. And in Disneyland Paris, there were a total of 11 corporate sponsors, and I ended up having 7 of them in Discoveryland. So Renault sponsored the Visionarium, Coca-Cola and Philips sponsored the Videopolis, BNP sponsored Orbitron, and IBM was involved, and Coca-Cola was involved, and Mattel sponsored the Autopia. So, that adds just another layer of complexity to the whole thing. That makes it a little tougher, to be honest with you.
But did you ever just want to start over, have a Discoveryland without Star Tours, without Captain EO, without Autopia, or were those kind of existing attractions helpful?
It kind of doesn't. I mean, at the time, you have to understand how consuming these places, develop these attractions are. I mean, you get to a certain point, you make decisions, and they go, okay, here's our program. We're going to start with Star Tours. And I like Star Tours. I said, I don't want to make this all kind of old fashioned, and that's one of the reasons why we justified doing, kind of a different futures. There was no question about that. But if you remember where they were, they were placed on the other side of the track. So all you saw were the facades. Now, here's the one thing that's interesting about the art direction on this whole land. Yes, if you look at the Orbitron, that was designed to be not only, and it ended up being a very unique attraction. I mean, it was a big old rocket ride, just a roundy rocket ride. I would have preferred to put it on top of one of the buildings, but, we just didn't have that opportunity to do that. But so I was able to get the kinetic sculpture up on top to, kind of be a planetary model or an astrolabe kind of feeling to it. But I didn't want everything just to be completely old. So although everything was done in these beautiful brass colors and copper colors and things like that, if you look at the land and you look at it today still, but even at that time you really see it, I edged everything in neon. So the neon kind of gave it this like laser beam look to it. And the reason for doing that is that I didn't want to be Victorian. I wanted it to be timeless. I wanted to take it out of, that's kind of that old thing, So, on front of the Visionarium show, we had these 4 spires that were going up, and there was crackle neon going in there, and it looked like energy was just being brought into the building. And that was what that was all about. I wanted to take it away. The whole design motif there was really to be taken off of the classic kind of Griffith Park Observatory, which has this kind of science lab to it. It's kind of like deco style. And then we put these towers on it that have all this crackle neon, and it was really quite beautiful. And it just kind of gave the whole land just a whole different color scheme. Again, when you are working on projects like a whole land, when you're in charge of a land, like I was in charge of the land, there are certain programming elements that you're given, in the classic sense of architecture. You have programs, and you have to have, they always knew that in Tomorrowlands, you had the Tomorrowland Terrace, and that's their big hamburger hot dog kind of thing. But there was also a tremendous need for entertainment. So, I said, fine, I'll take it on. We'll do this thing. And so, because I immediately saw what it could be. And I just said, in terms of this whole kind of type of future thing, one of the things that I wanted to do, and it's kind of a tribute to the old Discovery Bay design that Tony Baxter had done, is that I thought, why don't we just instantly turn this thing into some kind of a terminal for travel? See, if you remember everything about Discoveryland, let me take that back. When you look at all of Disneyland Paris, one of the keys about Disneyland Paris was that we focused very clearly. We focused on things, whether it's pirate ships and Skull Rocks and Big Thunder out in the middle of the lake and the castle and the Orbitron and all that. It was all about things. And in Discoveryland, I wanted vehicles. So we had Autopia. Tomorrowlands have always been especially the original Tomorrowland down at Disneyland was a land on the move. It was like you had between the monorail and the Phantom boats and the Autopia and the Skyway and it was everything about it was moving, and all those things have been taken out. So, Tomorrowlands are always about big, giant projects, big attractions, but I needed animation. So that was really what prompted all that animation in the Orbitron. But what I also wanted to do for Videopolis is that, that airship coming out, the airship from the island on top of the world was kind of a Jules Verne story. So I said, why don't we put that right at that location? When you come down Main Street heading toward the hub and you look to Discoveryland, you see that airship. And here is this gigantic thing. And, when you go to a culture that not everyone speaks English, they all speak image, right? They all speak icons. So, you're looking at this. So I have the X-Wing fighter out there. We have the Nautilus submarine here, and we have airspace, and, the air was the Hyperion airship, and space was the X-Wing fighter, and the sea is the Nautilus submarine. People they love that because then it gives them photo ops, and, it's architecture. You can make interesting architecture, but for some reason, there's something more compelling about doing vehicles. It shows it's a place on the move. It shows that it's dynamic. So that facility was 50,000 square feet of dining and entertainment. And I'm not sure that they ever, I think they were successful in some shows in terms of the entertainment, but certainly the dining was there, and huge covered spaces. And one of the reasons why we did a lot of that, and this goes also back to the original Discoveryland or Discovery Mountain concept, was that we were actually trying to get people indoors more often. Like we had those, the walkways on behind Main Street, that Eddie Sato did. And then, I did this giant, the Videopolis is just an enormous indoor dining experience, it has multiple levels and it's got a stage and all that. And, so we knew that the weather was going to be tough over there in the wintertime. So that's one of the reasons why we did it. So, and on top of that, that building was so, once we got it all kind of engineered out and structured, it was built like, Tinker Toys. It was built off site, and they came in and they erected that thing in about 2 weeks. It just went up like magic. I mean, it was fantastic to see that thing go up in the air,
Oh, for sure. I can imagine. Okay, so we've talked about pretty much everything in Discoveryland except for the big one. So I think I'm ready for the Space Mountain story.
Okay. All right. The original concept, and as I mentioned, a little bit like Videopolis, was really a big facility so we could get people indoors. So we decided to do a very large, what was to be called Discovery Mountain. And Discovery Mountain, it was called that because we didn't want to just call it another Space Mountain. Space Mountain, what Space Mountain is in Florida, it is at Disneyland, all of these things, but we wanted to make something really different because it was going to look completely different and it was going to function completely differently. So I started doing this mountain, which was 100 meters in diameter, which is 330 feet. And it was so big that on the inside, we had the Nautilus sitting in there. We had restaurants in there. I had a kind of a space shot attraction that shot you up out of the mountain and then would drop you back down again. And then above in the upper parts of the mountain was going to be a Space Mountain kind of ride. So you could look up into space and you saw the ride going. It was all above you. And there would be netting and all that, so things couldn't fall on you and all that. And so it was a very ambitious project. You probably have seen, I don't know how many renderings of it, but you'll find them in all the books. You'll see the Nautilus sitting, lights flooding down on it and people inside the mountain. And I did all these, several renderings of it. And so as we all know, the Disneyland Paris, as it became after a period of time, wasn't performing like the Walt Disney Company thought. In other words, it was the first stumble that the new Michael Eisner, Frank Wells administration had encountered, for whatever reason. I mean, I personally think that there was just too much money put into the hotels. The theme park was actually doing pretty well, did pretty well. But they were also having the administration or the management of the Walt Disney Company was having problems with the government of France, and they had to pay them, and it was becoming complicated. So I kept getting all these rumors like, well, we're not sure we could ever build that 100-meter diameter Space Mountain. And so I know that, Tony was really hanging on to that idea. And I, you get these late night meetings or you get called into offices after work hours and they're like, hey, listen, dude, if we want to make this thing happen, and we do need to make it happen, we need a major attraction over there for a second level. We need to start thinking about bringing this thing back down in size. And maybe we should just do a conventional Space Mountain, which was like a dagger to my heart. I said, no, we just can't do that. So eventually, short version is I just started looking at what would what would a 62 meter diameter Space Mountain look like in there? And
well, before you go on to Space Mountain from the Earth to the Moon, can we talk about the coaster that was going to be in Discovery Mountain? Because, you have the Journey to the Center of the Earth drop tower, you have the Nautilus, you have all that, but you also still have a coaster in there. Can you touch on that for me?
Yeah, from the Earth. Yeah, it was Jules Verne's story From the Earth to the Moon, which is an absolutely amazing story. If you ever read it, I mean, it's just quite amazing how the way he wrote the story was a bunch of businessmen after the Civil War in 1865. They were all sitting around going, "Oh my God, we're going to be out of business. So how do we stay in business?" So they decided to build this giant gun, and Jules Verne wrote the story and said, and he placed the gun in Central Florida, in a place called what he called Tampa Town, which is probably, if you look at a map on the original books, you see that it's really closer to where Orlando is. And he said, the only people who are ever going to do anything like this are going to be the Americans. And so, they built this bullet that somebody, the characters were going to go inside this bullet. The cannon was buried in the ground and then was shot into outer space. And then it's a little bit like the Méliès film where, the bullet goes into the moon's face and all that. But the original story was really quite amazing because it was very close to what originally happened. And I think in the 70s, Look magazine did a kind of an image by image description between the Apollo program versus also what Jules Verne had done with the drawings there, and shows the guy's weightless, and it shows it going to the moon. And then when the bullet lands, it's sitting in the water and has an American flag coming out of it, right next to like the Apollo or the very close to what the Apollo recovery missile or the capsule was all about. So I mean, he was a great visionary, and it was a great story. So so we just, for me, the whole catapult launch thing was just an absolutely necessary thing. I mean, many people probably have had this idea. I don't know how it goes, but I got it built, and it launched. I mean, there isn't a coaster today that doesn't have a catapult launch in it, but that was the first one. And I just thought, we'll just shoot it up and we'll go into the upper rafters of that building. And I mean, it was that building was actually bigger than the Space Mountain in Florida. And so, but it was just too overwhelming. And, if you had the Space Mountain of Disneyland's ride in a 330-foot building, there's a lot of room around there. So people could actually go in to the mountain, go directly from Videopolis into the mountain and never go outside. And it was always kind of a theatrical experience. The lighting was, very moody, and you saw Starfield up above. And I mean, it was really meant to be much, 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 much more theatrical, and, it was a tough decision to go away from that. It really was. It was difficult, but on the other hand, you begin to learn to understand if you want to create something, and you want to make it happen. A lot of times people don't want to work with you, and the management says, all right, then just put an old Space Mountain in there, and that wouldn't have worked for me. I just didn't like that idea. So there's a reality comes in, and it's a lot of it has to do with the performance of the park. But you know what? It doesn't sound. I don't want to make it sound like this is something that never happens. It happens all the time. Anything in motion pictures and entertainment and theme parks, you have to be, if you really want to build things in your life, you really have to be responsible to the good design and great stories, but you also have to be cognizant and aware of what the business side is about. And the business side, frankly, to be honest with you, is, sometimes we can't fund it. We just can't do that, So, I was able to get the Nautilus submarine in, and that was kind of an interesting story too. But that was the Nautilus was finished just before we finished Space Mountain, or the final Space Mountain.
Also, in the Discovery Mountain concept art, it shows people being able to, watch the coaster as it goes. And this kind of came through. Can you talk to me a little bit about, letting people see into the mountain?
Yeah, well, that was one thing I always thought was great. And that's why when we, finally did the smaller Space Mountain, I wanted that walkway that went all the way through. Because, first of all, again, I wanted people indoors in case it was raining or snowing outside, because the weather can be really inclement there. But the other part of it, there was the walkway was wide enough for people who didn't want to ride the ride. They could actually see the entire experience, or you could hear the ride, and there was a lot of black light in there, and you saw the train go zipping by, and you heard it heard people screaming, and it was great. I love the idea of the walkway through it. I think it was fantastic. And I don't know if it's still there. They may have taken it out, but it was fantastic. Because it was elevated up about 20 feet. So wherever you were, you looked down and you saw Starfield below you. You looked up, you saw Starfield above you. So it was like the perfect situation. And I was just told, you better figure something out. Because we have a budget, and there's a dollar budget for this. So you got to stick with that. So I had a great team, great project manager, Doug LeBlanc, and I had the engineering team on the whole project was fantastic. The creative team was, they're really great people. We did a lot of special effects. The special effects teams did a lot of special effects inside there. We were going to do 3 loops inside. We did do three episodes where you're upside down, and we're engineering it. We had Vekoma come in. I think they did all the track, and then we had to get the track done early because they were building the track, and then we're going to build the building around it. And so this was all part of the planning process. And the interesting story that focuses, to me, one of the most memorable days I ever had there was when you work on a project in Imagineering, there's probably every month you have a project update meeting. And what this is you have these long conference table, and there's probably can be anywhere from 25 to 40 people in the room. And they're mostly management of the company. There's head of engineering. There's whoever the executive is in charge of the company or in charge of the project, your project manager, your project team, estimators. It's a massive monthly endeavor that you have to go through there. And so whoever's in charge, you sit right across from them. And in this case, it was a gentleman who was a great leader and man by the name of Mickey Steinberg. And Mickey was just a tough old bird. He was an ex-ranger kind of guy, and pretty tough guy to deal with. And he built a lot of projects for Portman, and very experienced guy, and a great leader, a very military kind of guy, kind of like a General Patton. And I admired him a lot. It was great. So for months, we'd go into these meetings, and the budget was set at, I think it was $90 million or something like that. And every month, we would come in there and we'd be at $94 million, 94, 95, 96, 92, 91. And then you spent the entire month and you'd beat it down, and then it would bounce back up again. And then every meeting we'd go to was like, oh, God. And they were just like, how do we get it there? So this one meeting, and this was the most memorable meeting for me, is that I walked into this meeting, sat down, put all your papers down, you're looking across, and I start my presentation, and it was going to be my usual, I don't know why the costs keep creeping up. I really don't know why the costs keep growing. And Mickey looked across the me and he goes, stop. Just stop. I don't want to hear your speech anymore. Just stop. I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do. This afternoon, I'm going over to the studio, and we're signing an I'm getting the studio to sign an authorization for you to do this project at $90 million. Right? I don't care what Space Mountain you build. All I care about is 2 things. One, you keep this on program. You get in the attendance. You get in the capacity one, and you cannot go over budget. All right, now get the hell out of here. So I'm like, okay, I guess we have a project. And so, I looked at my project manager, and the word went out. It's like. And so one of the reasons for doing this is because Space Mountain, because Disneyland Paris had not been performing like they'd wanted it to, but they needed a major attraction. All right. So that launched us, and we watched every penny, and I prioritized where I wanted. We made decisions in the team, like where are the things we can build. And if we can add something later, we'll add it later. But there are certain things you had to build. I wanted the Catapult Launch. I wanted the onboard sound. The onboard audio was something that Tom Morris had been playing with for years with his little Walkman down at Disneyland, and he finally convinced them, and so we put it in on this attraction, and it was great, and really added a lot to it, and And so we were going forward, and we're starting, and they were project managers are like ready, they're ready to start digging holes and building the building, and we start that, and we start this process, and realized that we had to do some some cost breakdowns on this thing. So they said, oh, okay, you can't afford that big roof, concrete roof thing that we normally put up here. We're going to go to a Temcor roof, which was a kind of a metal prefabricated kind of roof. And I was like, I went and looked at them, and I just didn't like them at all. And I said, okay. And they go, well, that's too bad, because if we want to keep this on budget, if you want to get this built, we have to do that. So I said, fine, you can go ahead and do that if you let me decorate the exterior of the building. So all the gold that you see in those hexagonal shapes, that's a Temcor. It's a prefabricated kind of thing. But all the other trim and the structures and the ribs and all that. So I made a deal with them, and we ended up doing that. And I got the cannon that I wanted, and so the project continues. And I spent half my time from June of '94 to June of '95 when we opened. I spent 178 nights at the Disneyland Hotel. Right? I mean, I had to stay within 6 months. I just had to stay there. Anyway, so the project's getting developed, and we start testing, and we start. And the thing's going really well. I mean, it's really great. The ride is. I mean, you're sitting out there. I can't tell you how many nights you sit out there. It's 4:00 in the morning. It's starting to snow. The engineers are trying to get the programming correct, and you help guys out. You do whatever you can. You offer support, but. It's a lot of work. I'm not sure that all the fans know how much work actually go into these parks, but it's quite amazing. But it's exciting because you're working on something quite extraordinary, And there were times, one night, I was working on, we were building the mountain, and I left work around 10:30 at night. And, I decided, and I went home, had dinner, came back. And I came back around 2:30 in the morning just to come back. And I go walking. I park my car behind Discoveryland. I go walking out, and I see this lone figure, just walking. And I'm like, who's that? Who's that? So it ended up being Michael Eisner. And so we kind of walked the park all night. And I'd walk into attractions that were being, developed and programmed and all that. And Michael would walk in, and I go, hey guys, look, Michael's here with me, and so it was good. It was good. People like seeing management actually get in and do things and roll their sleeves up. And so it was kind of cool to do that. But as we got closer to the opening for Space Mountain, well, actually it was called Discovery Mountain. It's still Discovery Mountain. And all the logos, you see the DMs on the mountain, you'll see them on the vehicle. The sign said Discovery Mountain on it. And so I was out there one night, and Michael's there with all the management of the people there. And, they're saying, we don't think we can market Discovery Mountain. We know, Space Mountain is the marquee thing. So Michael goes, okay, fine. It's now Space Mountain. You have no excuses now not to make this thing amazingly great. So, so we had to change all the signs. We had to change everything. It was a real pain, but that's kind of what, again, last minute kind of things that you end up doing. So there were two more things that I wanted to talk about in terms of this. One of them was the Shoot the Moon network TV special that was done. Because what happened is that the attendance, the Walt Disney Company was talking about bailing out of Euro Disneyland because the attendance had gone down, and people were afraid of making their vacations to go, and the company was really angry with them. So anyway, they decided, well, we're going to shoot this TV special, and we're going to present it all over Europe. We're going to try and promote the park again. So this show was about specifically the Man in Space program that Walt Disney had. It was about that. And it was about their desire to showcase this particular attraction. So they wanted to do this TV network, European network show. It's called Shoot the Moon. And it was about Walt Disney's history with space travel, with the Man in Space program that I mentioned earlier. Secondly, it was about the Space Mountain attraction, literally itself. And then it was about the Space Mountain development, was what was going on. And And I hate to admit it, but I was the star of the show. So they shot me, and I can tell you, I am not an actor. I look at it, I just cringe. I think it was terrible. I had been traveling so much. I was like, I mean, also there's a major story point that makes no sense inside this TV show and all that. But aside from all that, when they showed this thing, they showed it all across Europe, and it was a huge success. I mean, I had kids writing me letters about, gee, I didn't realize the Imagineering was a thing like this, and you could actually design stuff like this, and don't know how it is, and didn't know things like that existed, and didn't know anything about Space Mountain or Imagineering, and it was actually kind of cool. I mean, I kind of enjoyed the fact that there was such popularity about this whole thing. So it got shown, and it was just about prior to the opening, and it was really quite successful. I mean, Coca-Cola did a promotion, and they did like 100 million Coke cans with the Space Mountain logo on it, and it was a huge promotion. And the fun thing, I have to say, the interesting thing about the actual opening of Space Mountain over in Paris was that since the park opened in '92 and this opened in June of '95, what happened is that in those 3 years, a couple of major things happened. One of them is all the cynical French guests who had come to the park had been there for 3 years. They actually now got what this Disney thing was all about and realized that Disney was all about quality. I mean, really great entertainment. It was really quite spectacular, And the second thing was that the cast members that were originally kind of blasé about the whole thing really had an emotional investment in the park, and they were so excited. And when the opening of Space Mountain came out, I mean, they had a massive opening. I mean, Elton John did a concert. They had this parade with all these European celebrities that came through. It was phenomenal. But just before that, the one thing that I was asked to do was Philippe Bourguignon, who was the president of Disneyland Paris. He was like, "Hey, listen, I got 125 bankers coming in. You have to go talk to them. You have to give them you have to tell them about the attraction, So I said, fine, And so they were so desperate. They were in the process of trying to refinance the park, and they were, their finances were tough, and the attendance was down, and Michael Eisner and everybody, they were totally nervous. They were totally freaked out. They were totally nervous about this because on one hand, the Walt Disney Company is telling them we're going broke. We're not making any money here. Number one, and number two, at the same time, we're building a $90 million attraction that you can see over there. It's a major icon at the park. So there was this dilemma. Okay, so Philippe comes to me and he goes, "Look, we're going to have all these bankers coming. You got to talk to them." So they had them in the ballroom at the New York hotel. And so I get up there and I run through all the renderings and go through the drawings, and all these bankers are there, and it's going really well. I mean, they're really kind of happy about it, And so I said, "Are there any questions?" And the most amazing questions that came out were like, "We think this attraction you're doing is fantastic. When are you guys going to start building more stuff?" And the administration for Disneyland Paris were shocked. They were like, they thought they were going to rip me apart, going, "Why are you spending money? Why are you spending?" They were going, "This is fantastic." So I said, "Well, this is great. So there's a special treat for you today. All of you are going to ride Space Mountain. It's available for you to ride." And so these guys are fantastic. We took them. They were so excited about it. They all get them on a bus. They take them behind the park. We lead them in, and this was the funniest thing of many things that we saw. So these guys would come in, but they all had briefcases, right? And they'd go and they'd load the train, and they put the briefcases, leave the briefcases right on the loading dock, right there, right next to the train. And then they would go off and they go flying in the mountain and get catapult launched up and hear the music and go through the ride. And then, 3 minutes later, they come screaming back. And these guys were so excited. It was like, and then they come back in and they pick up their briefcases and, could now go home and tell their kids that they had been riding on this ride. And so that was actually pretty cool. The whole opening experience was just fantastic. I mean, The response was huge. It was great. And if you really wanted the truth, I mean, this is the thing that shocks me today. That was in 95, right? That was what, I don't know, I have to do the math really quickly. But, that was the last major attraction for Disneyland Paris. That was the last major attraction that they've opened over there. They've opened a lot of things at the studio, but in terms of big attractions. Now they've changed the theming and they've made it more, kind of a Star Tours or Star Wars kind of theme. And, it doesn't the interior show is probably a good one. I haven't seen it, but, it doesn't match the exterior. But, I don't think people really matter. I still think, a lot of people really, 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 I get emails from people saying, we really love the original show and the original story, and it was great. And the punchline is that we came in under budget, after all that. So it was great. It was great. I mean, we barely came in under budget, but it was like by a couple $100,000, but it was like $89 million, and it was phenomenal, so it's been, a success ever since. It's been great. And probably the crowning thing was for the TEA. I won the Space Mountain. I accepted the award for winning it for the attraction of the year. And I said in the speech what I think is really a true statement about this. And it was like what I would consider, in quotes, a perfect attraction. It was wholly invented by Imagineering. It was a project that had new technologies in it, Catapult Launch System, onboard audio. It increased the attendance by 2 million people in 1 year. And it was under budget. And I said, this is all what we look for. This is the kind of thing that we all want, in all of our attractions. And so it was great. It was great. It was fantastic.
And Michael Eisner credited you as saving Disneyland Paris, right?
Yeah, I got a note that said, thanks for saving Disneyland Paris. That's not anecdotal. I'll show you. I mean, you can see, I got one of the note cards, the note cards that everybody at Disney writes on. Yeah. And I think it must have gone through Marty. So Marty probably didn't like that very much, but what the heck. So, I mean, hey, what can I say? It wasn't, thanks for giving me credit, but I mean, you don't do these. It takes hundreds of people to do these projects, but, you end up doing it. You end up, like this is, you got to fight for it. And then, doing the rendering, and it comes out just like this is what it was supposed to be, and it had a great team, really. And what happens then is, because when a project like that, it's post-opening, so, it was 3 years afterwards. So everybody else has moved on to, I don't know, whatever, Studio Tour or Animal Kingdom or whatever the hell it was. So you can actually pick and choose the people you really, really want. And you want a small group. And these people are so dedicated, and they're just fantastic. They were really fantastic.
Absolutely. Well, Tim, I'm going to ask, do you have anything else that you want to touch on before we go? Because if I don't stop myself, you're going to be here all night and all day tomorrow, too. So is there anything else that we haven't touched on that you really want to mention?
One thing that I do like to do, and one thing that I hope the people who listen to this, I hope you also listen to I like to emphasize the process and what it takes and the number of people and the talent that you need to build these projects, because that's really important. It's really important to me. And I built, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how many attractions I built, but I know I started and built, 4 Disney theme parks from scratch, from the day it was, dirt to the day you got the ribbon. And it takes a lot of talented people. And so I hope that emphasis came through, because it really is true. It really is quite true. And it's amazing too. It's fun. It's like you have families for 5 years and then you go off to another project and people and friends, for your entire lifetime, because in a way, you fought a battle together, and especially when they come out great, it's pretty neat. Pretty fun. So,
yeah. Well, on a much smaller scale, I felt like we fought a battle today trying to get through your entire career in under 2 hours, and I feel like we did a good job. So, on that note, Tim, thank you so much for giving me so much of your time today. Really, thank you for coming on.
All right, Kevin. Great. I appreciate it.
And thank you to everybody listening. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Thank you for visiting Defunctland.